The last rays of the setting sun painted the wooden cross atop the Alamosa church a deep crimson as Rebecca Lawson watched the banker climb down from his polished carriage, his shadow stretching long across her front yard like the fingers of fate itself. 3 months after burying her father, the vultures had finally come to collect Miss Lawson. Harold Winters adjusted his spectacles with one gloved finger, his smile as thin as the paper he clutched in his hand. "I trust you've reconsidered my offer." Rebecca stood tall on the porch of the home her father had built with his own hands 15 years ago. At 24, she had known this moment would come eventually, but not like this, not based on a loan she knew her father had never taken. "There's nothing to reconsider, Mr. Winters. My father never borrowed $500 from your bank." Her voice remained steady despite the hammering in her chest. "The paperwork you're claiming to have is either mistaken or what, Miss Lawson?" Winters' smile vanished. "Are you suggesting forgery?" "That's a serious accusation against the most respected institution in Alamosa." Rebecca clutched the railing, her knuckles white. The year was 1876, and Colorado had just achieved statehood, but out here, 30 miles from Alamosa proper, law was still whatever men like Winters decided it was. "My father kept meticulous records. There was no loan." Winters unfolded the paper with theatrical slowness. "His signature suggests otherwise. The court has already ruled, Miss Lawson. You have until the end of the week to vacate or pay the $500 plus $300 in interest." He glanced around at the modest ranch. "Though I dare say you'll find the first option more practical." As Winters turned to leave, Rebecca felt her world collapsing. The 20 acres of good grazing land and the house were all she had left after the consumption took her father. Without them, she had nowhere to go and no means to support herself. "You can't do this," she said, hating the desperation creeping into her voice. Winters paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Actually, my dear, I can and I have. Friday, Miss Lawson, either the money or your departure. Good day." As his carriage disappeared down the long road toward town, Rebecca sank onto the porch step, her mind racing through impossible solutions. She had exactly $12.43 hidden in a tin beneath a floorboard, 3 horses, and a small herd of cattle that might fetch $200 if she was lucky. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought her head up. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the deepening purple sky. Rebecca quickly wiped her eyes, unwilling to show weakness to whoever was coming. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the strong profile of Daniel Tanner, one of the few true cowboys left in the area. Daniel reined his dappled gray stallion to a stop at her gate. His face, tanned from years under the western sun, showed concern beneath the shadow of his worn hat. At 32, he was known throughout the county as a man who kept to himself, worked hard, and never got involved in other people's business, which made his appearance at her gate all the more surprising. "Evening, Miss Lawson," he called, his deep voice carrying easily across the yard. "Saw Winters riding away. Figured you might need a friendly face." Rebecca stood, smoothing her skirts. She'd exchanged words with Daniel Tanner exactly twice in her life, once at last year's town social and once at her father's funeral. Both times, he'd been polite but distant. "That's kind of you, Mr. Tanner, but unless you've got $800 in that saddlebag, I'm afraid there's nothing to be done." Daniel dismounted, his movements fluid and natural. Up close, his eyes were a startling blue against his weathered skin. "What's Winters claiming you owe?" Rebecca hesitated, pride warring with desperation. But what did pride matter now? "He says my father borrowed $500. With interest, I owe $800 by Friday. Did he?" "No." She met his gaze steadily. My father would have told me. And we never saw that money. Nothing in our lives changed. We struggled the same as always. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. May I water my horse? The request was so ordinary in the face of her catastrophe that Rebecca almost laughed. Of course, the trough is around back. She led the way, watching as Daniel removed his hat, revealing dark hair with just a touch of silver at the temples. He tended to his horse with gentle efficiency, speaking softly to the animal as it drank. You know, he said without looking at her, I had some dealings with Winters myself, about 3 years back. Man has a way of making numbers dance to whatever tune suits him. You think he falsified the loan? Daniel replaced his hat. I think Harold Winters has wanted this land since before your father homesteaded it. Good water access, flat terrain, it's worth more than most. Rebecca's throat tightened. That doesn't help me prove anything by Friday. No, Daniel agreed. It doesn't. He looked around the property with an appraising eye. How are you fixed otherwise? Cattle, horses. 3 horses including Rose. She nodded toward her father's old mare grazing nearby. 17 head of cattle, but they're scattered across the back range. Would take 2 days just to round them up to sell. Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then, I've got something that might interest Winters more than your land. Rebecca looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I mean, Daniel said carefully, that I've been holding something of his for safekeeping, something he values highly. Hope flared briefly in Rebecca's chest before common sense doused it. Mr. Tanner, I appreciate your concern, but I can't accept charity, or it's not charity, he interrupted, his voice taking on an edge she hadn't heard before. Winters and I have unfinished business. This just gives me a reason to settle it. He met her eyes. But I'll need a day or 2. Rebecca studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or pity. She found neither, only determination and something else she couldn't quite name. Why would you help me? We barely know each other. A shadow of a smile crossed his face. Your father was a good man. Helped me once when nobody else would. He shifted, uncomfortable with his own admission. Besides, Winters has been choking this county for years. Man needs to be stopped. The light was failing now, stars appearing in the eastern sky. Will you at least come inside for some coffee before you ride back? Rebecca asked. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. That would be welcome. Inside the small but neat house, Rebecca lit the lamps and stoked the stove while Daniel removed his hat, standing awkwardly in the main room. She was acutely aware of how long it had been since a man other than her father had stood in this house. Please, sit, she said, gesturing to the table where she and her father had shared countless meals. As she prepared the coffee, she could feel Daniel's eyes taking in the details of her home, the faded curtains her mother had sewn before Rebecca was even born, the bookshelf filled with her father's cherished volumes, the worn but clean furnishings. You've kept it nice, he said when she placed a steaming cup before him. Most folks, losing their parents young as you did, might let things slide. Rebecca took the chair opposite him. This house is all I have left of them, of the life they wanted to build. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. Mr. Tanner, I have to ask, what exactly are you planning to do? Daniel took a sip of his coffee before answering. Better you don't know the particulars, but I promise you this, it's nothing illegal and it won't bring trouble to your door. You'll forgive me if that's not entirely reassuring. A genuine smile broke across his face, transforming his features entirely. Fair enough. Let's just say Winters and I have history, and I've been waiting for the right moment to settle accounts. Rebecca wanted to press further, but something told her Daniel Tanner was a man who revealed things in his own time or not at all. Instead, she asked, How did my father help you? I don't remember you being around much before a few years ago. Daniel's expression turned distant. It was 71. I was riding with a cattle drive that got caught in an early blizzard near here. Lost most of the herd and my horse went lame. Your father found me half frozen on his property. He paused. Let me stay until the weather cleared, lent me a horse to get back to town. Never asked for anything in return. That sounds like him, Rebecca said softly, memories of her father's quiet generosity washing over her. They finished their coffee in companionable silence. When Daniel finally rose to leave, Rebecca walked him to the door, feeling strangely reluctant to see him go. I'll be back tomorrow, he said, settling his hat on his head. Try not to worry too much until then. Rebecca gave a short, humorless laugh. That's like asking the sun not to rise. Daniel paused on the threshold, his expression serious. Miss Lawson, Rebecca, I don't make promises I can't keep. Your land will still be yours come Saturday morning. With that, he was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Rebecca stood in the doorway long after he'd disappeared, wondering if she was foolish to place her hopes in a near stranger's hands. But what choice did she have? The next morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect autumn day that usually lifted Rebecca's spirits. Today, though, she moved through her chores mechanically, her mind churning with worry. The hens needed feeding, the cow milking, the garden tending life went on regardless of bankers and their schemes. By midday, there was still no sign of Daniel. Rebecca tried not to let disappointment settle in her chest. She'd been naive to think a man she barely knew would risk himself to help her. She was carrying water from the well when the sound of multiple horses approaching made her turn. 3 riders were coming up the road, 2 men flanking a woman on a handsome chestnut mare. As they drew closer, Rebecca recognized Daniel riding beside a tall, elegant woman whose bearing suggested wealth and position. The 3rd rider was a grizzled older man with a silver star pinned to his vest, Sheriff Morgan from Alamosa. Daniel swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped. Rebecca, he called, using her given name as if it were the most natural thing. I'd like you to meet Mrs. Alina Winters and Sheriff Morgan. Rebecca nearly dropped the water bucket. Alina Winters was known throughout the county as the banker's wife, though few had actually seen her. It was rumored she rarely left their mansion on the edge of town due to some mysterious ailment. Yet here she was, perfectly healthy looking, dismounting with Daniel's assistance. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. Miss Lawson, she said, her voice cultured and clear. I understand my husband has been causing you some difficulty. Rebecca glanced at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. Mrs. Winters, Sheriff, this is unexpected. Perhaps we could speak inside, Alina suggested. Once seated at Rebecca's kitchen table, Alina Winters wasted no time with pleasantries. Mr. Tanner came to see me last evening with a rather troubling story about my husband's activities regarding your property. Sheriff Morgan, still standing by the door as if uncomfortable sitting in a woman's home without invitation, cleared his throat. Mrs. Winters insisted I accompany her to hear this matter directly. Daniel remained standing too, positioned behind Alina's chair like some kind of guardian. Tell them what you told me, he said to Rebecca. Rebecca recounted everything: her father's death, Winter's sudden appearance with a loan document she'd never seen before, the court ruling in his favor despite her protests, and the ultimatum to pay or leave by Friday. Alina listened without interruption, her face betraying nothing. When Rebecca finished, the older woman reached into an expensive leather handbag and withdrew a small book bound in red leather. My husband believes I am an invalid, confined to my rooms and oblivious to his business affairs, she said, her tone matter of fact. This has afforded me certain advantages in observing his activities without his knowledge. She opened the book. "This is my personal record of my husband's transactions for the past 5 years, those that pass through our household accounts." She slid the book toward Rebecca. "Page 43, if you please." Rebecca turned to the indicated page and found a neatly inscribed entry dated 3 months earlier, just after her father's death. In elegant handwriting was written, "H. paid Wilson $50 for document preparation regarding Lawson property." "Wilson is the county clerk," Sheriff Morgan explained, leaning forward to see the book. "Man's been in Winter's pocket for years, but we've never been able to prove it." "There's more," Alina said. "Turn to the next page." There Rebecca found another entry. "H. celebrating acquisition of Lawson land. Says he'll double investment when railroad spur comes through." Rebecca looked up sharply. "Railroad spur? What railroad spur?" Alina's mouth thinned to a hard line. "The Denver and Rio Grande is planning an extension that will require right-of-way access across several properties west of town. My husband has been quietly acquiring land along the proposed route for months, using various methods, some more ethical than others. And my property lies directly in that path," Rebecca realized. "Precisely," Alina confirmed. "The railroad will pay handsomely for the necessary land, likely 10 times what it's worth for ranching." Sheriff Morgan rubbed his jaw, looking troubled. "This is mighty serious, Mrs. Winters." "Forgery, fraud, these are criminal matters." "Indeed they are, Sheriff, which is why I've brought you another item." From her bag, Alina produced an official-looking document bearing the county seal. "This is the original deed to the Lawson property, which my husband removed from the county records and replaced with his forged loan document." Rebecca stared at the deed, her father's neat signature at the bottom, free and clear of all liens or loans. "How did you get this?" she whispered. Alina's eyes flickered briefly to Daniel. "Mr. Tanner suggested where we might find it in my husband's private safe. I took the liberty of retrieving it while Harold was attending his weekly card game last night." Rebecca looked at Daniel, who met her gaze steadily. "You broke into the banker's house?" "No," Daniel said. "Mrs. Winters invited me in and she opened the safe herself. I've suspected my husband's dealings were not entirely above board for some time," Alina explained, "but I needed proof before acting. Mr. Tanner provided the catalyst when he came to me with your story." Sheriff Morgan shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Winters, much as I appreciate your coming forward, this puts me in a difficult position. Your husband is a powerful man in this county. More powerful than the law, Sheriff." Alina's voice was like ice. Morgan straightened. "No, madam, no one's above the law." He turned to Rebecca. "Miss Lawson, I'll need you to make a formal statement in town, and Mrs. Winters, I'll need that journal as evidence." "Of course," Alina agreed. "But perhaps we could resolve the immediate issue of Miss Lawson's property first. The deed should be returned to the county records, and the fraudulent loan document destroyed." "That'll have to wait for a judge," Morgan began. "No, it won't," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm. "Rebecca's being forced out on Friday. We don't have time for legal proceedings." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, Morgan sighed. "Fine. I'll take the deed back today. Note the discrepancy in the records. Should be enough to stop any eviction until a judge can hear the full case." Relief flooded through Rebecca. "Thank you," she said, looking at each of them in turn, her eyes lingering longest on Daniel. "Don't thank us yet," Alina said, rising from her chair. "My husband won't take this lying down when he discovers what I've done." She trailed off, a flash of vulnerability crossing her composed features. "You have somewhere safe to go, Mrs. Winters?" Rebecca asked, surprising herself with her concern for this woman she'd just met. Alina smiled tightly. My sister in Denver has been urging me to visit for years. I think now would be an excellent time to accept her invitation. I've already packed a valise. I'll escort you to the station myself, the sheriff assured her. As they prepared to leave, Daniel hung back. When the others were outside, he turned to Rebecca. "I'll come back this evening if that's all right. Make sure you're settled." Rebecca nodded, suddenly tongue-tied. This man had appended his own life to help her, a near stranger. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." "Then don't say it," he replied simply. "Just be here when I get back." With that, he followed the others out, leaving Rebecca standing in her doorway, watching the unlikely trio ride away, her deed clutched tightly in her hand. True to his word, Daniel returned as the sun was setting, this time bringing supplies from town: coffee, sugar, flour, and other staples Rebecca had been too worried to purchase in recent days, unsure if she'd even have a home to store them in. "You didn't have to do that," she protested as he carried the goods into her kitchen. "Figured you hadn't been to town much lately," he said with a shrug. "And I was there anyway, giving my statement to the sheriff." Rebecca set about putting the supplies away, keenly aware of Daniel's presence filling her small kitchen. He seemed larger here than he had this morning, when a leaner and the sheriff had commanded so much attention. "Sheriff Morgan sent a deputy to inform Winters that he's wanted for questioning," Daniel said, leaning against the doorframe. "But Winters wasn't at the bank or at home." Rebecca paused, a bag of flour in her hands. "What does that mean?" "Could mean nothing. Could mean he's rabbited. Or it could mean he's coming here," Rebecca said quietly, voicing the fear that had been nagging at her all afternoon. Daniel's expression hardened. "That's why I'm staying tonight." Rebecca nearly dropped the flour. "Here. But I'll sleep in the barn," he added quickly. "But I'm not leaving you alone until we know where Winters is and what he's planning." She wanted to protest, to insist she could take care of herself as she had for months since her father died. But the truth was, Harold Winters terrified her, and the thought of facing him alone if he came here in a rage was more than she cared to contemplate. "All right," she agreed. "But not in the barn. The spare room hasn't been used in a while, but the bed's made up." Daniel looked like he might argue, then nodded. "Thank you." They shared a simple supper of beans, bacon, and fresh bread Rebecca had baked that morning. The domesticity of it struck her as they sat across from each other at the small table, lamplight casting a warm glow over everything. "How did you know to go to a leaner Winters?" Rebecca asked as they finished eating. Daniel took a sip of coffee before answering. "Few years back, I was working as a stock inspector for the county. Caught a rustling operation that traced back to one of Winters' business associates. When I brought the evidence to the sheriff, the charges mysteriously disappeared, and so did my job." He set his cup down. "After that, I started paying attention. Noticed Mrs. Winters at church sometimes, way she watched her husband. Woman had eyes that saw everything. Figured if anyone knew what Winters was really up to, it'd be her." "That was a considerable risk," Rebecca observed. "She could have been loyal to him." "Could have," Daniel agreed. "But I've gotten pretty good at reading people. Had to in my line of work." His gaze met hers across the table. "Same way I knew you were telling the truth about the loan." Something in his steady gaze made Rebecca's cheeks warm. She stood abruptly, gathering their plates. "It's getting late. I should show you to your room." The spare room was small but neat, containing just a bed, a chair, and a small chest of drawers. Rebecca had aired it out that afternoon, but it still held the faint mustiness of a room too long unused. "It was my father's," she explained, lighting the lamp on the dresser. "I haven't had the heart to change anything." Daniel set his saddlebags on the chair. "It's fine. Better than where I usually sleep." Rebecca lingered in the doorway. "And where is that, usually?" "Here and there. I've been taking odd jobs since I lost my position. Ranch work mostly, sleeping in bunkhouses or under the stars. No home of your own? She regretted the question immediately, afraid it sounded judgmental. But Daniel just shook his head. Had a place once over near San Luis, lost it in '73 when the banks collapsed. His tone was matter-of-fact without self-pity. Been waiting for the right spot to settle again. Rebecca nodded, unsure what to say. Well, good night then, Mr. Tanner. Daniel, he corrected gently. Think we're past formalities now. Daniel, she repeated, the name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue. Good night. Good night, Rebecca. She closed the door and retreated to her own room, her mind whirling with the events of the day and the man now sleeping under her roof, a near stranger who had risked everything to help her, keep her home. Sleep came fitfully with dreams of Harold Winters looming over her, his face twisted with rage. She woke before dawn, the house silent around her. For a moment she wondered if she'd imagined everything: Daniel's arrival, Alina Winters' evidence, the sheriff's intervention. But then she heard movement in the kitchen, the soft clink of coffee cups and the creak of the stove door. The smell of coffee soon wafted through the house, drawing her from bed. Daniel was at the stove when she entered the kitchen, his back to her as he tended the fire. He'd put coffee on and was slicing bread from yesterday's loaf. You didn't have to do that, she said. He turned, offering a slight smile. Figured it was the least I could do for imposing on your hospitality. Hardly an imposition when you saved my home, she pointed out, moving to help him with breakfast preparations. They worked together easily, as if they'd done it countless times before, their movements complementary rather than colliding. As they sat down to eat, Daniel said, I need to ride into town today, see what's happening with Winters. Will you be all right here alone? Rebecca wanted to say yes immediately to prove she wasn't afraid, but the truth was she was. What if he comes while you're gone? Daniel considered this. You have a gun, my father's rifle. I know how to use it. She'd learned to shoot when she was 12, her father insisting every woman on the frontier needed to defend herself. Daniel nodded approvingly. Keep it handy, but I doubt Winters would come during daylight. Man like that prefers to work in shadows. All right, Rebecca agreed, but you'll come back. Something flickered in Daniel's eyes. Count on it. After he'd ridden out, Rebecca tried to focus on her usual chores, but her nerves were strung tight. Every distant sound made her reach for the rifle she'd propped by the door. Midday came and went with no sign of Daniel returning. Rebecca forced herself to eat a small lunch, though anxiety had robbed her of appetite. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard a vehicle approaching. Grabbing the rifle, she hurried to the front of the house, her heart pounding. A fancy black carriage was coming up the road, not Daniel on horseback as she'd hoped, but Harold Winters' personal conveyance. Rebecca checked the rifle was loaded and positioned herself on the porch, the weapon visible but not aimed. As the carriage drew closer, she could see it wasn't Winters driving but his assistant, a nervous young man named Peterson. The carriage stopped and Peterson climbed down, looking around anxiously before approaching the porch. Miss Lawson, he called, stopping a respectful distance away when he noticed the rifle. I've come from Mr. Winters. Where is he? Rebecca demanded, not lowering the gun. Peterson swallowed visibly. Gone, miss. Left town last night. Asked me to deliver this to you before I joined him in Denver. He held out an envelope. Rebecca hesitated, then descended the steps, keeping the rifle ready. She took the envelope with her free hand. What is this? I don't know, miss. He just said it was important you received it. Peterson backed toward the carriage. I'd best be going. Train leaves in an hour. Rebecca let him go, watching until the carriage disappeared down the road before opening the envelope. Inside was a bank draft for $800 and a terse note. Miss Lawson, consider our business concluded. This payment represents fair compensation for the inconvenience you have experienced. Harold Winters. Rebecca stared at the draft in disbelief. $800, the exact amount he'd claimed she owed. Not an admission of guilt, certainly, but a retreat nonetheless. Eleanor's evidence must have struck deeper than they'd realized. She was still standing there, note in hand, when Daniel galloped up an hour later, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Rebecca," he called, dismounting almost before his horse had stopped. "Are you all right? Sheriff just told me Winter's man was seen heading this way." "I'm fine," she assured him, showing him the note and bank draft. "Winters is gone. Running to Denver, it seems." Daniel read the note, his expression darkening. "Man thinks he can buy his way out of criminal charges." "What do you mean?" Sheriff Morgan was preparing to arrest him this morning. "Apparently Winters got wind of it and fled." Daniel handed the note back. "That draft is as good as a confession." Rebecca looked down at the paper in her hand. $800. She met Daniel's gaze. "It's blood money." "It's your money," he corrected firmly. "Winters stole your peace of mind, threatened your home. Take it." "What would I even do with such a sum?" Daniel shrugged. "Whatever you want. Fix the roof, buy more cattle, put it away for hard times." A smile touched his lips. "Your father would be practical about it." Rebecca couldn't help but laugh. "He would, wouldn't he?" She folded the draft carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Daniel said. He hesitated, then added, "Though I would appreciate coffee now and then if I happened to be riding by." The implication that he'd be coming back, that this wasn't the end of whatever had started between them, warmed Rebecca more than she cared to admit. "I think that can be arranged," she said. "In fact, there's a fresh pod on right now, if you're not in a hurry to get back to town." Daniel's smile broadened. "No hurry at all." The next few weeks brought dramatic changes to Alamosa. Harold Winters never returned, choosing to forfeit his standing in the community rather than face criminal charges. The bank temporarily closed until a new manager could be appointed from Denver. Eleanor Winters, meanwhile, filed for divorce from the safety of her sister's home, a scandalous but ultimately respected decision given the revelations about her husband's business practices. For Rebecca, life settled into a new rhythm. With Winters gone and her property secure, she found herself able to plan for the future rather than merely surviving day to day. She deposited the bank draft in the Pueblo Bank, 40 miles away, unwilling to trust Winters' institution even under new management. Daniel Tanner became a regular visitor. At first, he would stop by every few days, usually around supper time, with the transparent excuse of just passing by. Rebecca always invited him to stay for a meal, and gradually his visits grew longer and more frequent. They fell into an easy companionship, working side by side on ranch chores, mending fences, tending cattle, preparing for the coming winter. Daniel never presumed or imposed, but his steady presence filled a void Rebecca hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. One crisp November evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple, Daniel turned to her with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Rebecca," he began, his deep voice unusually soft, "I've been thinking." She looked at him, taking in the strong profile she'd come to know so well over the past month. "A dangerous pastime," she teased gently. He smiled, acknowledging her attempt to lighten the moment. "I've been riding from the Taylor place every day to come here. It's a fair distance." "It is," she agreed, wondering where he was heading. Daniel took a breath. "There's a piece of land adjoining yours to the west, 20 acres with a small cabin that needs work. It's for sale." Rebecca's heart quickened. "You're thinking of buying it," he nodded, his eyes meeting hers directly. "If that would be agreeable to you. Being neighbors, I mean." The careful phrasing didn't fool Rebecca. This was about more than convenience or neighboring properties. This was Daniel Tanner putting down roots next to her and asking, in his roundabout way, if she welcomed that prospect. "I think," she said carefully, "that would be very agreeable indeed." The tension in Daniel's shoulders eased. "Good. That's good." He cleared his throat. "And perhaps if I'm just over the hill instead of across the county, we might see about." He trailed off, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man of action. Rebecca took pity on him. "About courting properly?" Relief flooded his features. "Yes, that," she smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fading sunlight. "I'd like that very much, Daniel." He reached across the space between their chairs, his calloused hand finding hers. The touch was simple but profound, a promise of things to come, of a future neither had dared imagine just months ago. True to his word, Daniel purchased the neighboring property the following week, using savings he'd accumulated during his years of wandering. The cabin, as he'd warned, needed significant work. The roof leaked in 3 places. The chimney was crumbling, and the door hung askew on rusted hinges. But Daniel attacked the repairs with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. Rebecca helped when she could, bringing meals to him as he worked and offering suggestions on improvements. By Christmas, the cabin was weathertight and habitable, if still sparse in furnishings. Their courtship progressed with frontier practicality. Daniel came for supper several times a week, and they attended church together in a limosa on Sundays. The townsfolk, who had initially viewed their relationship with raised eyebrows and whispered speculation, gradually accepted them as a pair. Rebecca discovered that Daniel, despite his reputation for keeping to himself, was well respected among the ranchers and tradesmen of the county. Winter settled over the valley with a vengeance in January of 1877. Heavy snow isolated the outlying ranches, making travel to town nearly impossible for weeks at a time. Daniel moved his few horses into Rebecca's larger barn, and they combined their herds in the sheltered southern pasture, where they could be more easily fed and monitored. During one particularly fierce blizzard, Daniel stayed in Rebecca's spare room for 3 nights, unable to safely make the half-mile journey to his own cabin. They spent the snowbound days in comfortable domesticity, reading aloud from Rebecca's small library, playing checkers at the kitchen table, and talking for hours about their lives before they'd met. Rebecca learned that Daniel had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith who'd lost everything in the Civil War. He'd come west at 18, working his way through Kansas and Colorado as a drover, ranch hand, and eventually stock inspector before Winters engineered his dismissal. In turn, she told him about growing up as an only child on this isolated ranch, her mother's death from fever when Rebecca was 14, and the quiet determination with which her father had raised her afterward, teaching her not just women's work, but everything needed to run the ranch independently. "He would have liked you," she told Daniel one evening as they sat before the fire. "He valued honesty above all else." "I would have liked to meet him," Daniel replied, his gaze on the dancing flames. After a moment he added, "My father would have liked you too. He always said a person's worth was in their backbone, not their bankbook." When the weather finally broke, allowing Daniel to return to his own cabin, Rebecca found herself missing his presence in a way that surprised her. The house seemed emptier, the evenings longer without his quiet company. Spring arrived early that year, the March sunshine melting the snowdrifts and turning the valley brilliantly green. As the roads cleared, Rebecca and Daniel made a trip to Alamosa together, their first visit to town in nearly 2 months. The changes were immediately apparent. The bank had reopened under new management. A stern-looking man from Denver named Cartwright, who, the locals reported, ran things with scrupulous adherence to regulations. Several new businesses had opened along the main street, and there was talk of the railroad spur that had been the source of so much trouble the previous year. "They're putting the station 2 miles west of town," Sheriff Morgan informed them when they stopped to pay their respects. "Not crossing any private lands at all, going around instead. Cost the railroad more, but saved them a heap of trouble after the winter's scandal." As they walked back to their wagon, Rebecca felt Daniel's hand at the small of her back, a protective gesture that had become familiar over the months. The simple touch sent warmth through her despite the spring chill in the air. "Would you like to have supper at the hotel?" Daniel asked as they passed the Alamosa House, the town's only proper restaurant. "My treat." Rebecca hesitated. They had never dined together in public, and doing so would be a clear statement about their relationship status to the entire town. But looking at Daniel's hopeful expression, she found she didn't care what anyone thought. "I'd like that very much." The dining room was busy with the supper crowd, and their entrance drew several curious glances. Daniel led Rebecca to a table near the window, pulling out her chair with formal courtesy that made her smile. He might be a cowboy by trade, but his manners would have passed muster in any Eastern drawing room. They had just placed their orders when the dining room door opened again, admitting a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. Rebecca recognized him immediately as Judge Harmon, the circuit court judge who had ruled against her in Winter's original claim. Daniel followed her gaze and stiffened. "We can leave if you'd prefer." "No," Rebecca said firmly. "I have nothing to be ashamed of." Judge Harmon surveyed the room and spotted them. After a moment's consideration, he approached their table. "Miss Lawson," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Tanner, good evening." Rebecca nodded coolly. "Judge," the judge cleared his throat. "Miss Lawson, I owe you an apology. It has become clear that I was misled in the matter of your property last year." Rebecca was too surprised to respond immediately. Daniel spoke instead. "That's generous of you to admit, Your Honor." Judge Harmon's expression was troubled. "Not generous, Mr. Tanner, necessary. Justice must not only be done but be seen to be done. I failed in that regard." He turned back to Rebecca. "The court has formally expunged all records of the false claim against your property, Miss Lawson, and I personally wish to express my regret for the distress caused." Rebecca found her voice. "Thank you, Judge Harmon. I appreciate your candor." The judge nodded, then added, "I understand congratulations may soon be in order for you both." His gaze moved meaningfully between them. "Small towns and their gossip, you understand." With that, he continued to his own table, leaving Rebecca staring after him. "What did he mean by that?" she asked Daniel, turning back to find him looking distinctly uncomfortable. "What congratulations?" Daniel shifted in his seat. "I suppose word gets around. Mrs. Peterson at the general store asked me some pointed questions when I was in town last month." "What kind of questions?" Daniel's ears reddened slightly. "About my intentions toward you." "And what did you tell her?" Rebecca pressed, her heart suddenly racing. "I told her my intentions were honorable but private." He met her eyes directly. "Though I had hoped to have this conversation somewhere more private than the hotel dining room." Rebecca barely noticed when their food arrived, her attention entirely focused on Daniel's face. "What conversation would that be exactly?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Rebecca, I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but these past months have been the happiest of my life." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I love you." I think I started falling in love with you that first evening on your porch, when you stood up to Winters with nothing but courage and determination. Rebecca felt tears stinging her eyes. "Daniel, please, let me finish before I lose my nerve," he said with a small smile. "I know it hasn't been that long and maybe this is too soon, but life out here is uncertain. When you find something good, you hold on to it." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'd like to hold on to you, Rebecca Lawson, for the rest of our lives if you'll have me." The dining room seemed to fade away, the murmur of conversations and clinking of cutlery receding until there was only Daniel's face, his blue eyes filled with hope and vulnerability. "Yes," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'll have you, Daniel Tanner." His smile transformed his face, years seeming to fall away in an instant. "Are you certain? I'm not a wealthy man, I don't need wealth," Rebecca interrupted. "I need you, I love you." The words, once spoken, felt as natural as breathing. She had loved him for months, she realized. Perhaps since the moment he'd ridden up to her gate promising to help when no one else would. They finished their meal in a happy daze, barely tasting the food, too absorbed in this new reality to notice the knowing smiles directed their way from other diners. By the time they left the hotel, the news of their engagement had already begun spreading through Alamosa's efficient gossip network. They set the wedding date for June 10th, giving them time to prepare properly. Rebecca insisted on a small ceremony at their ranch rather than in town, with only a few close friends in attendance. Daniel readily agreed, having no family to invite and little desire for social pageantry. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations. Rebecca sewed a new dress of pale blue cotton, not white, which seemed impractical for a frontier wedding, but special nonetheless. Daniel worked with a carpenter from town to build a proper bedroom set for their home, his first attempt at fine woodworking resulting in a handsome, if slightly uneven bed frame and matching dresser. They decided to make Rebecca's house their primary residence, being larger and better established, while keeping Daniel's cabin for guests or hired help during busy seasons. Together they replanted the vegetable garden, expanded the chicken coop, and made plans for increasing their combined cattle herd in the fall. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the June sunshine turning the valley into a panorama of wildflowers and green grass. Rebecca stood before her mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she pinned her mother's cameo brooch to her bodice, something old to complement her new dress. A knock at her bedroom door announced Mrs. Wilson, the storekeeper's wife who had come early to help her prepare. "It's time, dear," she called. "The Reverend just arrived and your young man is pacing a trench in the front yard." Rebecca opened the door, suddenly overcome with a wave of emotion. "Is it silly to be nervous? I've known him for months." Mrs. Wilson patted her hand. "Not silly at all. I was terrified the day I married Mr. Wilson, and we'd been courting for 2 years. She adjusted Rebecca's collar slightly. "But I haven't regretted a single day since, not even when he's at his most infuriating." The simple ceremony took place under the old cottonwood tree that had shaded the front yard since Rebecca's childhood. Daniel stood waiting, looking uncharacteristically formal in a new shirt and his best denims, his dark hair slicked back and his face freshly shaved. When their eyes met as Rebecca walked toward him on Sheriff Morgan's arm, the sheriff having agreed to stand in for her father, the love in Daniel's gaze nearly stopped her heart. This was right, she knew with bone-deep certainty. This was what her parents had wanted for her, not just survival, but happiness. Reverend Thompson, the circuit preacher who visited Alamosa monthly, performed the brief ceremony with dignity and warmth. When Daniel slid a simple gold band onto Rebecca's finger purchased on his last trip to Pueblo, his hands were steady while hers trembled. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Thompson declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Daniel's kiss was gentle but sure, a promise sealed before their small gathering of friends and neighbors. As they turned to face the applauding group as Mr. and Mrs. Tanner, Rebecca felt as though her heart might burst with joy. The wedding feast that followed was a community effort. Every guest had brought something to share, resulting in a table groaning with roasted meats, fresh bread, pies, and cakes. Sheriff Morgan had contributed a bottle of fine Kentucky bourbon, for toasts only, though several of the men seemed determined to ensure it didn't go to waste. As the celebration continued into the evening with fiddle music and impromptu dancing on the packed earth of the yard, Daniel pulled Rebecca aside to a quiet spot behind the barn. "Happy, Mrs. Tanner?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Deliriously so, Mr. Tanner," she replied, resting her hands on his chest, "though I'm still getting used to the name." "You'll have time," he said softly. "A lifetime." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. "I have a wedding gift for you." Rebecca took it curiously and unfolded it to find a deed to Daniel's property. "I don't understand. It's in your name now, too," he explained. "Just like I've added my name to yours. Everything we have belongs to both of us, equally." His expression grew serious. "I never want you to feel vulnerable again, Rebecca. If anything ever happened to me," she pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping the words. "Nothing is going to happen to you. We're going to grow old together on this land." Daniel kissed her fingers before gently moving them. "Even so. This protects you, protects us. No one can ever threaten your home again." Rebecca felt tears welling. In a world where married women had few legal rights to property, Daniel's gift was more than generous. It was a profound statement of his respect and trust. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching up to kiss him again, heedless of any wedding guests who might wander by. The guests departed as twilight deepened, leaving the newlyweds to begin their life together in the home that had seen so much change in the past year. As Rebecca stood in the doorway watching the last wagon disappear down the road, Daniel's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "Welcome home, wife," he murmured. Rebecca leaned back against his solid strength. "Welcome home, husband." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Their cattle business prospered as Colorado's population grew, creating steady demand for beef. They added onto the house, building a larger kitchen and a proper parlor for entertaining. Daniel's reputation for fair dealing and hard work spread throughout the county, bringing opportunities for expansion and profitable contracts. In the spring of 1879, their son James was born after a difficult labor that left Rebecca weak for weeks afterward. Daniel proved himself a devoted father, often carrying the infant in a sling across his chest while he worked around the ranch, much to the amusement of their occasional hired hands. When Rebecca recovered her strength, they settled into the rhythm of raising a child while managing their growing ranch. James thrived in the open air and freedom of rural life, toddling after his father from the moment he could walk and developing a precocious vocabulary from the hours Rebecca spent reading to him. By the time their daughter Elizabeth arrived in 1881, the Tanner Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the county. They employed 2 permanent hands and additional help during busy seasons. The railroad spur that had once been Winter's obsession was finally completed, though it passed several miles north of their property, sparing them the disruption while still providing convenient access to markets. The scandal surrounding Harold Winters had largely faded from local memory, though Rebecca occasionally received letters from Alina, who had rebuilt her life in Denver as a respected businesswoman, running a small but successful millinery shop. Winters himself had never returned to Colorado, reportedly settling in San Francisco under a different name, a fact confirmed by a Denver and Rio Grande Railroad detective who had recognized him by chance during a business trip. On a warm summer evening in 1883, as they sat on their expanded front porch watching 6-year-old James and 2-year-old Elizabeth chase fireflies in the twilight, Daniel took Rebecca's hand in his. "You ever wonder what would have happened if Winters hadn't tried to steal your land?" he asked. Rebecca considered the question. "Sometimes I might have just gone on struggling alone, never knowing what I was missing." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I probably would have kept drifting, taking work where I could find it." He squeezed her hand gently, "Never finding home." "Then I suppose, in a strange way, we owe him a debt," Rebecca mused. "His dishonesty brought us together." "I'd rather give credit to your father," Daniel countered. "If he hadn't helped me that winter, I might never have felt compelled to help you." Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children's joyful play. "Either way, here we are." "Here we are," Daniel agreed softly, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As darkness fell fully over the Colorado Valley they called home, Rebecca Tanner reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a desperate young woman facing the loss of everything to a wife, mother, and successful rancher. The banker had tried to take her home and her land, and a cowboy had paid a debt she'd never owed. But what Daniel had given her went far beyond saving her property. He had given her partnership, family, and a love that had only deepened with each passing year. And that, she knew, was a debt she would happily spend a lifetime repaying.